In 2016, the congregation of New Life Church in New Orleans witnessed a wedding that quickly became the talk of the town. Pastor Julian Brooks, a charismatic and ambitious 32-year-old preacher, stood at the altar beside Rosalind, a 58-year-old widow known for her wealth and extensive philanthropic efforts. Their union raised eyebrows among the parishioners, many of whom quietly questioned why a man in the prime of his life would marry a woman nearly 3 decades his senior. Julian, however, dismissed the whispers with his usual charm and reassured everyone that their marriage was divinely ordained. From the outside, their relationship appeared flawless. Julian delivered stirring sermons on love, sacrifice, and divine purpose, while Rosalind stood by his side, her presence lending credibility to his ministry. Her financial contributions bolstered the church's charitable programs, and she often praised Julian for his vision and leadership. The congregation, despite their skepticism, could not deny the prosperity that seemed to flourish under Julian's guidance. Yet beneath the surface, a darker reality simmered, one that Rosalind, in her deep trust and devotion, had yet to uncover. Behind closed doors, Julian lived a life of indulgence and deception. The same voice that spoke of faithfulness and integrity from the pulpit whispered sweet nothings to the young women in the congregation. Late-night meetings, hushed conversations, and unexplained absences became common occurrences. Church donations, intended to support community programs, found their way into Julian's personal accounts, funding expensive suits, lavish dinners, and secret getaways. To him, the marriage was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated scheme, a gateway to financial security and unchallenged authority. Rosalind, accustomed to seeing the good in people, overlooked the warning signs. She believed in Julian's words, in the sincerity of his touch, and in the image he carefully curated for the world to see. Whenever doubts crept into her mind, she pushed them aside, reassuring herself that Julian was a man of God, a man who loved her and valued their union. Yet, small inconsistencies began to surface, receipts for hotel stays she never knew about, late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room, and a growing emotional distance that gnawed at the edges of her once unwavering faith in him. James Miller, a longtime friend of Rosalind and a dedicated member of the church, was not so easily convinced. From the moment he heard of their engagement, a sense of unease settled in his chest. He had known Rosalind for years, watched her rise through hardship, and always admired her generosity and strength. The idea that she had been swept up by Julian's charisma left him skeptical. James observed the pastor carefully, noting the inconsistencies in his words and actions, the calculated way he spoke about their relationship, and the way he seemed to bask in the privileges their marriage afforded him. Despite his misgivings, James remained silent, not wanting to interfere without proof. He watched from the sidelines as Rosalind invested more and more of her resources into the church, blindly trusting Julian's guidance. He noticed how the pastor's sermons shifted subtly, weaving messages that reinforced his role as a leader and provider, emphasizing obedience and sacrifice. It was a slow but deliberate manipulation, and James could see it clearly. He began to quietly investigate, digging into financial records, speaking with those who had once been close to Julian, and piecing together a troubling pattern. As time passed, Rosalind's once radiant smile began to falter. The woman who had always carried herself with grace and assurance now seemed weighed down by an invisible burden. She rarely spoke of her concerns, but James could see the questions forming behind her eyes. Julian, meanwhile, continued his charade, growing bolder in his deceptions, unaware that the walls around his carefully constructed life were beginning to close in. The whispers within the congregation grew louder with each passing Sunday. Members who once revered Julian now spoke in hushed tones about his late arrivals and the young women who lingered after services. Rumors swirled, but no one dared to confront him directly. His sermons, once inspiring, began to feel rehearsed and empty, his charm stretched thin under the weight of his growing indiscretions. Rosalind found herself caught between doubt and loyalty. She had built her life on trust and faith, but the cracks in her marriage were becoming impossible to ignore. The man she had once seen as her salvation was slowly revealing himself to be something far different. And as her suspicions grew, so did her resolve to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. James, sensing her growing doubts, prepared himself for the inevitable moment when Rosalind would seek answers. He knew that confronting the truth would not be easy for her, but he also knew that the woman he had always respected was stronger than she realized. Julian Brooks had built his empire on deception and charm, but even the most carefully constructed lies could not withstand the weight of the truth for long. Unbeknownst to Julian, his perfect world was teetering on the brink of collapse. And Rosalind, once blinded by love and devotion, was beginning to see through the facade, ready to uncover the man behind the pulpit. Months after the wedding, Rosalind began noticing subtle yet unsettling changes in Julian's behavior. He often returned home late, offering vague explanations about extended prayer meetings and impromptu counseling sessions with troubled parishioners. At first, she accepted his excuses without question, trusting his dedication to the church. But over time, the inconsistencies in his stories grew harder to ignore. His suits carried unfamiliar scents, sweet floral perfumes that she never wore, and his phone vibrated with calls at odd hours, which he always answered in hushed tones before stepping out of the room. At dinners, he appeared distracted, his eyes darting toward his phone with an urgency that didn't align with the loving husband he claimed to be. Rosalind's initial trust began to waver, replaced by an uneasy feeling she couldn't shake. Despite his reassurances, the distance between them grew. When she reached for him at night, he often feigned exhaustion, rolling away with a tired sigh. Yet his energy seemed boundless outside the home, delivering impassioned sermons and charming the congregation with his infectious enthusiasm. The first real crack in her trust came when she accidentally stumbled upon a collection of receipts tucked inside his jacket pocket. Elegant restaurants she had never visited, five-star hotels that bore no connection to his ministry, each piece of paper whispered of a life she wasn't a part of. She sat in silence, staring at the evidence, her heart pounding in her chest. Julian had always been careful with his words, but numbers did not lie. Determined to uncover the truth, Rosalind turned to the only person she could trust, James Miller. With his steady, watchful presence, James had been silently observing Julian for months, quietly suspecting that something was amiss. Together, they began piecing together Julian's comings and goings, tracking his whereabouts and cross-referencing church events with his absences. It didn't take long before troubling patterns emerged. Julian frequently met with young women from the congregation, always under the pretense of spiritual guidance. He scheduled private prayer sessions in his office after hours, and several women had been seen leaving in a flustered state, avoiding eye contact as they exited the church premises. Meanwhile, Julian reveled in the freedom his double life afforded him. He saw himself as untouchable, his position within the church a shield against scrutiny. He expertly balanced his personas, the devoted husband and the revered pastor by day, and the charming seducer by night. His confidence grew with each conquest, and his secret encounters became bolder. He would whisper promises of spiritual enlightenment, weaving scripture into his seduction with a finesse that left his victims feeling chosen, special. Each affair was carefully managed, each woman assured that she was the only one. Melissa Hill, a 28-year-old member of the congregation, had been one of his favorites. She was drawn to his charisma, enamored by his presence and the way he made her feel seen in a way no one else had. But as their secret meetings became more frequent, her infatuation turned into something darker, an expectation for more. She wanted commitment, a promise that Julian was unwilling to make. Her once loving messages turned into veiled threats, subtle reminders that she knew too much. She began to demand answers, pressing him about the future of their relationship and questioning the legitimacy of his marriage to Rosalind. Julian felt the walls closing in around him but refused to acknowledge the danger. He underestimated Melissa's determination, brushing off her concerns with his usual charm. He believed he could keep her at bay, as he had with the others, feeding her just enough attention to keep her from acting out. What he didn't realize was that Rosalind was watching, and the cracks in his carefully constructed facade were beginning to widen. Late one evening, Rosalind followed Julian to the church under the guise of delivering forgotten documents. She stood in the dimly lit hallway, listening to the murmurs from his office. The tenderness in his voice, the intimate tone he used, these were not words spoken by a man of God to a troubled soul. Peering through the partially opened door, she saw him seated close to a young woman, their heads almost touching. The warmth in his gaze, the way his hand lingered on hers, it was a confirmation of her worst fears. The realization struck Rosalind like a blow, and she staggered back into the shadows, her breath ragged. Her world, once built on faith and love, was now crumbling beneath the weight of betrayal. She clenched the folder in her hands, her knuckles turning white. Julian had betrayed not only her trust but the trust of their entire congregation. And yet, she knew that confronting him outright would not be enough. He was too cunning, too persuasive. She needed more evidence, something undeniable, something that would expose him for who he truly was. As Julian continued to weave his web of deceit, Rosalind silently gathered the threads, preparing for the moment when the truth would finally come to light. She could no longer be the devoted wife standing in his shadow. She was ready to step into the light and reveal the darkness that lurked beneath his holy facade. Rosalind could no longer ignore the truth that had been steadily unraveling before her eyes. The weight of her suspicions pressed heavily on her, but she needed undeniable proof before confronting Julian. One evening, while he was in the shower, she found his phone carelessly left on the nightstand. Her hands trembled as she unlocked it using the code she had memorized long ago but never dared to use. The screen lit up, revealing a flood of unread messages, each one more damning than the last. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of messages from different women. Some were affectionate, filled with declarations of love and longing, while others were explicit, accompanied by photographs that left no room for misinterpretation. Scrolling through the texts, Rosalind felt her heart sink deeper with each flick of her finger. Messages with promises of trips, expensive gifts, and intimate confessions confirmed what she had feared the most. Julian had not only betrayed her trust but had done so with reckless abandon, believing himself untouchable. She sat frozen on the edge of their bed, staring at the screen in disbelief. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, shattering every illusion she had carefully held onto. The man she had trusted with her heart, her life, and her fortune had been deceiving her from the very beginning. Her breath quickened, and a surge of anger mixed with heartbreak rose within her. Desperate for clarity and support, Rosalind turned to James Miller. She showed him the messages, her hands shaking as she scrolled through the damning evidence. James' face darkened with concern, his suspicion of Julian now confirmed beyond doubt. He urged her to take the messages to the police, arguing that Julian had not only deceived her but likely misused church funds for his affairs. He spoke with urgency, warning her that Julian would not back down easily and that she needed protection. Despite James' advice, Rosalind hesitated. Her instincts told her that Julian needed to be confronted first, that perhaps, deep down, there was still a chance for him to confess and repent. She wanted to hear it from him, to see if any part of him was capable of remorse. Fueled by a desperate hope for honesty, she decided to face him alone. That night, she waited for him in the living room, the phone clutched tightly in her hands. The house was eerily silent, the ticking of the clock on the wall echoing in the background. When Julian walked through the door, he carried himself with his usual confident stride, oblivious to the storm waiting for him. He smiled at her, unaware of what awaited. Rosalind stood still, her expression cold and unwavering. As she held up the phone, the glow from the screen illuminating her face, Julian's smile faltered. She confronted him with the messages, demanding answers. At first, he tried to deflect, his voice smooth and composed, spinning excuses with the same charm he used from the pulpit. He insisted they were harmless interactions, mere misunderstandings blown out of proportion. But as Rosalind pressed on, reading aloud the explicit messages, his mask began to crack. Realizing that denial was futile, Julian's demeanor shifted. His face darkened, and his usual charm gave way to something far more sinister. The man who once spoke of love and faith now stood before her with cold detachment, his lips curling in frustration. His voice turned sharp, laced with anger as he accused her of betrayal, claiming she had no right to go through his private matters. Rosalind, unfazed, pressed harder, her voice steady but firm. She demanded to know how long he had been lying, how many women there had been, and if any part of their marriage had ever been real. Julian's composure crumbled further, and in that moment, she saw the man beneath the facade, the one driven by greed, selfishness, and an insatiable hunger for power. Panic flickered in his eyes as he realized the consequences of his actions could no longer be contained. He was not prepared to lose everything, the comfortable life Rosalind's wealth provided, the adoration of his congregation, and the unchecked control he had so carefully cultivated. Rosalind stood her ground, unwilling to let his intimidation sway her. For the first time, she saw him for who he truly was, a manipulator, a liar, and a man who had built his entire life on deception. As she held the phone tightly, she knew that this confrontation was only the beginning of the battle that lay ahead. Julian, sensing the walls closing in, took a step toward her, his eyes narrowing with barely concealed rage. The air between them grew heavy with unspoken threats, and for the first time, Rosalind felt a creeping sense of fear. She realized that exposing him would not come without risk, but she had already made her choice. She would not remain silent any longer. The confrontation escalated with alarming speed. Rosalind's voice, once measured and composed, now filled the room with raw emotion. She demanded the truth, her accusations cutting through the air like a blade. Julian paced restlessly, his mind racing for a way out. His polished veneer of calm was gone, replaced by frantic movements and desperate pleas. He insisted that what she had found meant nothing, that it was all a misunderstanding, but his words lacked the conviction they once carried. He begged her to keep the revelations between them, promising to change, to seek forgiveness, to be the husband she had believed him to be. But Rosalind, resolute and unwavering, refused to be manipulated any longer. Her defiance only fueled Julian's frustration. His voice grew louder, his gestures more erratic. He towered over her, his once gentle touch now a firm grip on her arms as he tried to make her see reason. Rosalind struggled, pulling away, her face contorted with a mixture of anger and fear. She was no longer the quiet, trusting woman he had married. She had seen through his lies, and there was no going back. The tension reached its breaking point. Julian, overwhelmed by the looming collapse of his carefully constructed life, lashed out without thinking. He grabbed her arms with a force that startled even him, his fingers digging into her skin. Rosalind gasped, trying to pull free, but his grip tightened in a desperate attempt to regain control. She stumbled backward, her heels scraping against the hardwood floor as she struggled to maintain her balance. In a single, horrifying moment, Julian's hand pushed harder than he intended. Rosalind's foot slipped, and she reeled backward. Her body twisted awkwardly, and before she could steady herself, the sharp edge of the marble table caught the back of her head. The sickening sound of impact echoed through the room, freezing Julian in place. Her body crumpled to the floor, lifeless and still. A crimson pool began to spread beneath her, staining the pristine white tiles. Her once vibrant eyes, filled moments ago with fire and resolve, were now vacant and unfocused. Julian stood frozen, staring down at the scene with a growing sense of horror. His chest heaved, and a choked gasp escaped his lips as the reality of what had just happened settled in. For a fleeting moment, he dropped to his knees beside her, shaking her shoulders gently, whispering her name in a trembling voice. There was no response. The warmth of life was already slipping away from her body. Panic clawed at his throat, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He pressed his hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, but deep down, he knew it was too late. Rosalind was gone. His thoughts spiraled into chaos. He had not meant for this to happen. It was an accident, a moment of lost control. But accidents had consequences, and he knew the truth would ruin him. The weight of his secrets, the life he had so carefully built, would crumble under the weight of this single irreversible act. He pulled back, his hands stained with her blood, trembling violently. Julian staggered to his feet, pacing the room, his mind racing for a solution. He needed to think, to act quickly. Calling the police was out of the question. They would never believe him. They would see the bruises on her arms, the argument overheard by neighbors, and the years of deception that Rosalind had uncovered. His life, his reputation, his ministry, everything would be over. His eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could help him conceal what had happened. He wiped his bloody hands on his shirt, his breathing ragged and uneven. He thought about moving the body, creating a story that might divert suspicion. But with every step he took, doubt crept in. How long before someone came looking for her? How long before James, who had already suspected him, raised the alarm? The weight of his actions pressed down on him like an anchor, dragging him deeper into the abyss of his own making. As he stood in the dimly lit room, the only sound was the soft ticking of the clock, a cruel reminder that time was slipping away, and with it, any hope of escaping the consequences of his crime. Rosalind's absence did not go unnoticed. When she failed to attend the Sunday service, murmurs of concern spread through the congregation like wildfire. Rosalind had always been punctual, a pillar of the church, and her sudden disappearance left an unsettling void. Julian stood at the pulpit, his voice steady but his mind in turmoil. He could feel the weight of their gazes, their whispered concerns, and the unspoken questions that lingered in the air. He delivered his sermon with forced composure, but deep inside, panic gnawed at him. James Miller was the first to act. Rosalind had confided in him too many times for him to ignore her absence. He knew something was wrong. When Julian brushed off questions about her whereabouts with vague excuses, James's suspicions grew stronger. He pressed the issue, urging the authorities to look into it. Reluctantly, the local police agreed to conduct a welfare check at the Brooks residence. Detective Camilla Wright, a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for deception, led the inquiry. Upon arriving at the house, she noticed subtle signs of distress, curtains drawn too tightly, a faint but lingering metallic scent in the air, and Julian's overly polite but nervous demeanor. He invited them inside, maintaining his usual charm, but his body language betrayed him. She observed the way his eyes avoided certain areas of the room, the stiffness in his posture, and the occasional tremor in his hands. As the officers inspected the house, they found small but telling details that pointed to something sinister. A faint smear of blood was detected on the edge of the marble table in the living room, hastily wiped but not thoroughly cleaned. A closer examination of the floor revealed tiny specks of dried blood near the baseboards, overlooked in Julian's frantic attempt to cover his tracks. Wright ordered forensic analysis, and within hours, it was confirmed to be Rosalind's. Julian's carefully constructed alibi began to crumble. He claimed Rosalind had gone to visit a friend out of town, but when police checked, they found no record of her travel arrangements. Phone records indicated that her last known location was at the house, contradicting Julian's statement. As detectives questioned neighbors, they mentioned overhearing loud voices and crashing sounds the night before her disappearance. One neighbor recalled seeing Julian pacing outside in the early hours of the morning, looking agitated and disoriented. James, determined to bring the truth to light, provided the police with additional evidence he had gathered. He handed over printed emails and text messages Rosalind had shown him, messages from Julian's various lovers, laced with empty promises and desperate pleas for secrecy. He also presented financial statements indicating unusual withdrawals from the church's accounts, money that had been funneled into expensive hotels and jewelry purchases. Wright reviewed the materials carefully, connecting the dots that pointed to Julian's pattern of deceit. As the investigation deepened, one of Julian's former lovers, Melissa Hill, came forward with damning testimony. Under pressure from investigators, she admitted that Julian had paid her hush money to keep their affair secret. She described how he had confided in her about his marital frustrations and his plans to free himself from the constraints of his marriage. Her testimony painted a picture of a man who had grown desperate and reckless, willing to do whatever it took to maintain his facade. The evidence was overwhelming. Forensic analysis of Julian's car revealed traces of Rosalind's blood in the trunk lining, further confirming the worst suspicions. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station captured Julian driving alone late at night, appearing anxious and constantly checking his rearview mirror. Each piece of evidence chipped away at his carefully curated image, exposing the cracks beneath his righteous exterior. As the walls closed in on him, Julian's behavior grew more erratic. His once confident demeanor gave way to paranoia, and he struggled to maintain control. His sermons became disjointed, his energy waned, and the congregation's trust in him weakened with each passing day. Parishioners who once revered him now watched him with wary eyes, whispering amongst themselves about the rumors swirling through the community. Detective Wright was patient but relentless, pushing Julian further into a corner. She knew that with enough pressure, he would eventually break. And as the weight of the evidence mounted, Julian's carefully orchestrated world was on the brink of total collapse. The trial of Julian Brooks became a spectacle that captivated the entire community. Media outlets covered every development, and crowds gathered outside the courthouse each day, eager to catch a glimpse of the disgraced pastor. The once revered spiritual leader now sat in the defendant's chair, his once pristine reputation tarnished beyond repair. He wore a stoic expression, but the tension in his jaw and the nervous tapping of his fingers betrayed his inner turmoil. The prosecution presented a damning case, meticulously laying out the evidence that painted Julian as a manipulative deceiver who had exploited his position for personal gain. Video footage from security cameras showed him disposing of items in the dead of night, while financial records revealed a trail of embezzlement that stretched back years. Witness testimonies were particularly devastating. Parishioners who once admired him now took the stand to describe the discrepancies they had ignored for too long. Melissa Hill's testimony was the most incriminating. She detailed her affair with Julian and his desperate attempts to cover up his indiscretions, including his offer of hush money. The defense, in a last-ditch effort to salvage what little dignity Julian had left, attempted to portray him as a man under immense pressure, a devoted leader who had succumbed to temptation but never intended for things to spiral so far out of control. They argued that Rosalind's death was an accident, a tragic result of a heated argument gone too far. However, the jury remained unconvinced. The evidence of his financial misconduct, his affairs, and the undeniable proof of Rosalind's injuries made it clear that Julian was no victim of circumstance. Throughout the proceedings, Julian's composure slowly eroded. The weight of his lies bore down on him as the prosecution systematically dismantled his carefully constructed facade. He avoided eye contact with the spectators, many of whom had once considered him a mentor and guide. Their eyes, once filled with admiration, now reflected betrayal and disappointment. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the decision, guilty of involuntary manslaughter and multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. Julian sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the floor as the weight of the sentence, 20 years in prison, settled over him. The judge's words were clear and resolute, emphasizing the breach of trust and the irreparable harm he had caused to the community. As the gavel struck, sealing his fate, a collective sigh echoed through the courtroom. Some members of the congregation wept, while others whispered prayers for justice. The church that had once been a sanctuary of faith and hope was now tainted by scandal, and in the weeks following the verdict, it was officially closed. The congregation fragmented, some still clung to the belief that Julian had been a victim of unfortunate circumstances, while others felt betrayed and sought solace in new places of worship. James Miller, despite his grief, found a sense of closure in the verdict. He had stayed the course, ensuring that Rosalind's truth was revealed and justice was served. He dedicated his time to helping those who had been affected by Julian's betrayal, working to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. Meanwhile, Rosalind's charitable organizations were placed under new management, and her legacy of generosity lived on. For Jocelyn, Rosalind's longtime confidant, the ordeal had been life-altering. She had once seen Julian as a beacon of hope, only to realize how easily appearances could deceive. Determined to reclaim her faith in humanity, she started over in a new city, focusing on her personal growth and spiritual healing. Julian's name became a cautionary tale, a reminder that corruption can hide behind even the most righteous facades. The scandal left a permanent scar on the community, a lesson in the dangers of blind faith and the importance of holding those in power accountable. The echoes of his deceit lingered, but so too did the resilience of those who had suffered because of him. They moved forward, forever changed, yet stronger in their pursuit of truth and justice.